The wind had a name in this part of the country. It wasn't a gentle breeze that whispered through leaves. It was a thief that stole the moisture from a woman's lips and the hope from her heart. It scoured the plains, pushing a relentless sun before it, a sun that beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth until it resembled the bottom of a dry creek bed. Across this unforgiving canvas walked Clara. She did not hurry, for there was nowhere to run from the vast, empty sky. She did not slow, for to stop was to surrender. Her steps were a grim, steady rhythm against the silence, each one a small victory against the desolation that stretched to every horizon. Her shoes, worn thin as paper, offered little protection from the sharp stones and stubborn roots of the prairie grass. Her dress, a faded calico that had seen 100 washings, was caked with the pale dust that rose with every footfall. She carried a small bundle tied with twine, containing all she owned in the world, a spare shift, a worn Bible with a broken spine, and a photograph of a man she no longer allowed herself to remember. She was a ghost walking in the full glare of noon, her past a shadow that followed too closely, her future as blank and intimidating as the land itself. Days of walking had blurred into one long ache. She had been seeking work, a place to rest her head where she could earn her keep and be left alone. The last town, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings, had offered nothing but suspicious glances and closed doors. A woman alone was either a burden or a temptation, and Clara had no stomach for being either. It was a liveryman, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. Who had pointed west? "McCready," he'd grunted. "Lost his wife to the fever last spring. His place is a mess. Might need a hand." And so she walked west, toward a name, toward the slim possibility of a roof and a meal. The McCready Ranch appeared first as a smudge of darker brown against the endless tan of the plains. As she drew closer, it resolved into a sturdy but lonely-looking house, built of solid timber to withstand the wind, and a barn that leaned just a little, as if tired. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin, gray finger pointing to the sky, the only sign of life for miles. A man was out by the corral, his back to her, mending a fence post with powerful, deliberate swings of a mallet. Clara stopped at the edge of the yard, waiting. She had learned not to approach a man's property unannounced. She stood perfectly still, letting the wind tug at the loose threads of her shawl, until he finally sensed her presence. He turned slowly, the mallet held loose in one hand. Luke McCready was a man carved from the same hard material as the land he worked. His face was tanned to the color of old leather, etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused and capable, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, settled quiet that seemed to absorb the world without judgment. He was not old, perhaps 35, but he carried himself with the weight of a man who had already lived a full and painful life. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Sir," she replied, her own voice clear, though her throat was raw with dust. "I was told in town you might be in need of a housekeeper." He studied her for a long moment. His gaze was direct, missing nothing, the weariness in her posture, the fine lines of strain around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. She met his look without flinching, her own gaze just as steady. She had nothing to hide because she had nothing left to lose. "My wife, she passed," he said, the words simple, flat. "The house has been let go." "I'm a hard worker," Clara stated. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. "I can cook, clean, mend. I keep to myself." That last part seemed to interest him. He looked from her to the silent house, a place that had surely grown too large and too quiet for one man. He nodded slowly, a barely perceptible motion. "I can offer room and board, not much in the way of coin." "Room and board is enough," she said. And so, the bargain was struck, as plainly and unadorned as the landscape around them. He led her inside. The house was as he'd said. A layer of dust coated every surface. Dishes were piled by the dry sink, and the air was stale with neglect and solitude. But it was a good house. The floors were solid, the hearth wide. It had strong bones. Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. "Your room is at the back," Luke said, pointing down a short hall. "Mine is upstairs. You'll have your privacy." He laid out the terms with the same stark efficiency. "I'm out before sunup and back after sundown. Meals are at your discretion. The work is yours to manage. I won't interfere." He paused, his gray eyes fixing on hers again. "The only thing I ask is quiet. No questions about what was, no talk of what might be." "I understand," Clara said. And she did. They were two solitary souls agreeing to share a space. Not a life. They were ghosts in the same house. And the rules were simple. Do not haunt one another. The first weeks were a silent dance of carefully observed boundaries. Clara rose in the pre-dawn dark, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the kitchen by the time Luke came in, his face still shadowed with sleep. He would eat at the small kitchen table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes on his plate. He would nod his thanks, a curt dip of his chin, and be gone before the sun had fully breached the horizon. Clara, in turn, waged a quiet war against the dust and disorder. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the wood gleamed. She aired out the linens until they smelled of sun and wind instead of sorrow. She polished the tarnished silver from a wedding set she found wrapped in flannel at the back of a cupboard, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns, wondering about the hands that had last held them. She worked with a tireless, methodical energy, pouring all her unspoken grief and fear into the rhythm of her chores. The house slowly came back to life under her care, but it remained a quiet life. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the creak of floorboards, and the distant, mournful call of the wind. Their conversations were transactions of necessity. "Need more flour from town. The pump handle is loose. There's a storm coming from the north." Words were tools, used for a purpose and then put away. Yet, in the shared silence, a fragile trust began to grow. It grew in the way she knew just how he liked his coffee, black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. It grew in the way he started leaving a stack of freshly chopped kindling by the back door for her each morning, a task he never mentioned and she never acknowledged. It was a trust built not on confession or companionship, but on mutual reliability. He was a man who did what he said he would do. She was a woman who did the same. In the brutal uncertainty of the West, that was a rare and valuable thing. One evening, the change began. The day had been long and hot, and a merciful coolness was finally bleeding into the air with the setting sun. The sky was a spectacle of bruised purple and fiery orange. Clara was out in the yard, hanging the last of the laundry on the line. The white sheets billowed in the gentle breeze, catching the golden light, clean and pure against the dramatic sky. She moved with an unconscious grace, her arms reaching up, her body silhouetted against the dying light. Luke was sitting on the porch steps, mending a bridle, his head bent over his work, but his hands had stilled. He was watching her. It was not the first time he had looked at her, but this time was different. His gaze was unguarded, stripped of the careful neutrality he usually wore like armor. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness, a quiet hunger for the simple peace she represented. He wasn't looking at a housekeeper. He was looking at a woman bringing a sliver of light and order into his dark, empty world. He saw the strength in the line of her back, the grace in a simple, domestic act, and for a moment, the wall he had built around his heart showed a crack. The air between them shimmered with a tension that had nothing to do with their spoken arrangement. When Clara turned, feeling his eyes on her, he looked away quickly, his attention abruptly back on the leather in his hands. his knuckles white, but she had seen it. And in that fleeting moment, the foundation of their careful, silent world had shifted. The next week, while dusting the small, Spartan room Luke used as an office, Clara found the letter. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't left out either, tucked beneath a heavy ledger book. Her hand brushed it as she wiped the desk, and a few words, written in a bold, neat hand, caught her eye. Curiosity, an emotion she had long suppressed, pricked at her. It was his private business, a line she had promised not to cross. But the memory of his look at sunset, the strange new current in the house, compelled her. Her hands trembling slightly, she unfolded the single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a letter he had sent, dated 3 months prior, just before she had arrived. It was addressed to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. "To whom it may concern," it began. "My name is Luke McCready. I am a rancher, a widower. In good health and of sound character, I seek a wife. I do not have poetry to offer, but I have a good home and a strong back. I am looking for a decent, honest woman who is not afraid of hard work or quiet living. Someone to build a new life with, to be a partner and a wife in all things. Someone to fill this empty house." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. A mail-order bride. He wasn't just lonely. He was actively seeking to end his loneliness. He was looking for a wife. The realization was a cold stone in her stomach. All the small comforts she had taken in their quiet routine, the fragile sense of belonging she had started to feel, it was all a temporary illusion. She was just a placeholder, a hired hand keeping the house warm until its true mistress arrived. Her face, reflected dimly in the window pane, was a mask of placid calm, but inside, a storm raged. It was a foolish, bitter jealousy for a man she had no claim on, for a life she had no right to want. She carefully refolded the letter, slipped it back beneath the ledger, and ensured everything was exactly as she had found it. She finished her dusting, her movements precise and automatic. Later that evening, when she served him his supper, her hands were steady, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago how to build walls within herself, and now she built one higher and thicker than ever before. Luke noticed nothing, or if he did, he gave no sign. The silence between them returned, but now it was heavier, colder, filled with the weight of a letter she was never supposed to have read. Days later, a letter arrived for him. He read it standing by the window, his back to her. She watched him, her heart pounding a dull, painful rhythm against her ribs. He folded it and put it in his pocket without a word. But she knew. She could feel the finality in the air. The bride was coming. The night before the stagecoach was due, a profound stillness settled over the ranch. The wind had died down, and the sky was a vast expanse of black velvet, punctured by the brilliant, cold light of 1,000 stars. Luke sat on the top step of the porch, his shoulders slumped, staring out into the darkness. He had been there for over an hour, a solitary silhouette against the faint light spilling from the doorway. Inside, Clara finished washing the last dish. She dried her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. She could have gone to her room, left him to his vigil. It was his life, his choice, his future arriving on the morning stage. It had nothing to do with her, but she couldn't. The silent bond they had forged, however fragile and unnamed, wouldn't allow it. She poured hot water from the kettle over tea leaves in 2 tin mugs. She added a spoonful of honey to each, then carried them outside. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. She held out one of the mugs. He looked at it, then up at her face, his gray eyes searching for something in the dim light. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a brief, startling second. She sat down on the step below him, not too close, but not far either. She wrapped her hands around her warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. They sat in silence, the two of them, watching the constellations wheel slowly across the heavens. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and mysterious in the starlight. Nothing was said. There were no words for the complicated knot of gratitude, resentment, and a strange, shared sorrow that hung between them. He was mourning the end of his solitude. She was mourning the end of a peace she hadn't realized she'd found. He was letting go of the ghost of one wife to welcome another. She was a ghost of a different sort, about to be displaced again. Yet, in that moment, under the immense and indifferent sky, they were not a rancher and his housekeeper. They were just a man and a woman, side by side in the dark, sharing a silent, impossible goodbye to something that had never truly been allowed to begin. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust and noise that felt like an invasion. It was a lumbering alien creature in the vast silence of the prairie, and it brought with it a woman who was just as foreign. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Luke walked out to meet it, his posture stiff, his hat held in his hands in a gesture of formal welcome that seemed unnatural for him. A young woman stepped down, and the first thing Clara noticed was the color of her dress, a bright, hopeful blue, the color of a robin's egg, a stark contrast to the muted, sun-bleached tones of the land. She was younger than Clara had imagined, barely out of her girlhood, with a cloud of fair hair that had come loose from its pins and a face that was soft and unlined by hardship. She carried with her the scent of the East, of rain-washed cities, and a life that knew nothing of relentless wind and cracked earth. This was Elsie. In her eyes, wide and searching, was a desperate, fragile hope, the kind Clara herself had once known, before life had burned it out of her. Luke took her valise, his movements careful, almost clumsy. Their words were lost to the wind, but Clara could see the exchange, a transaction being honored, a promise being kept. When he led Elsie toward the house, toward her new home, Clara stepped back from the window, her hands automatically smoothing the front of her plain gray apron. She was the housekeeper. That was her place. She must remember her place. The wedding was 2 days later. The circuit judge, a portly man with a wheezing laugh, performed the ceremony in his dusty office in town. It was a swift, perfunctory affair. Stripped of all sentiment, Luke's voice was steady as he spoke the vows, the words a commitment of duty rather than passion. Elsie's voice was a soft, trembling whisper, the sound of a girl leaping into a future she could not possibly comprehend. Clara did not go. She remained at the ranch, and while they were gone, she moved Luke's few personal belongings from his downstairs room to the larger one upstairs, the one that had belonged to his first wife. She changed the linens on the bed, her hands moving with a mechanical efficiency that betrayed no emotion. She scrubbed the floor and aired out the room until it held no trace of the past. When they returned, man and wife, she had a hot meal of roasted chicken and biscuits waiting on the table. Mrs. McCready, Clara said, her voice even and low, her eyes fixed on a point just past Elsie's shoulder. Welcome home. The name hung in the air between them, a solid, unbreachable wall. Elsie flushed, a mixture of pride and unease, and murmured a thank you. Luke said nothing, his gaze heavy, but he wouldn't meet Clara's eyes. The three of them sat down to eat, and the silence in the house, once a shared and comfortable thing between two people, became a suffocating weight among three. Life became a series of careful negotiations around unspoken tensions. The house, which had seemed so vast and empty, now felt claustrophobically small. Clara and Elsie moved through it like wary cats, each acutely aware of the other's presence. They avoided being in the same room alone, communicating through necessities left on the kitchen table, a mending basket, a list of needed supplies. Elsie tried to assume the duties of a wife. She would attempt to cook a meal, her soft hands clumsy with the heavy cast-iron skillet, only to find Clara had already prepared something simpler and more to Luke's taste. She would try to mend one of Luke's shirts, her stitches small but uneven, and later see it disappear from the mending pile, only to reappear in his drawer, repaired with Clara's neat, invisible stitches. Elsie was the mistress of the house in name only. Clara was its silent, efficient heart. The knowledge was a constant, galling humiliation for Elsie, a daily reminder that she was an outsider, a replacement who didn't quite fit. Clara, for her part, retreated even further into herself. She became a shadow, her footsteps so light they barely creaked the floorboards. She rose earlier, went to bed later, her entire existence devoted to the smooth running of the household, to making herself so indispensable and so invisible that she could not be sent away. She bore Elsie no ill will, only a deep, weary ache for the quiet life that had been stolen from her. She was enduring, as she had always endured. Then came the small incidents that chipped away at the walls they had built. One afternoon, Elsie, in a fit of determination to prove she was more than a decorative doll from the East, decided to learn to ride properly. She saddled one of the gentler mares, ignoring the quiet warnings in her own mind. The horse, sensing her fear, grew skittish. A sudden gust of wind rattled the barn door, and the mare shied violently. Elsie cried out, her hands slipping from the reins, her body tilting precariously. Before she could fall, a firm hand shot out and grabbed the bridle, pulling the mare's head down with a strength that was both absolute and calming. It was Clara. She had been weeding the small kitchen garden nearby and had moved with a speed that belied her quiet demeanor. She spoke to the horse in a low, soothing murmur, her hand stroking its neck until it stood trembling but still. Only then did she turn to Elsie. "She needs a steady hand," Clara said, her voice devoid of judgment. She helped Elsie dismount, her grip on Elsie's arm firm and supportive. The younger woman was pale and shaken, her pride warring with a profound sense of gratitude. She could only nod, unable to speak. For the first time, she saw Clara not as a rival, but as a pillar of competence in a world that terrified her. A week later, Luke was working with a half-wild steer in the corral when a hoof lashed out. Catching him high on the thigh, he limped back to the house, his jaw tight with pain, a dark stain of blood spreading through his denim trousers. Elsie rushed to him, her face a mask of panic. She fluttered around him, asking what she should do, her distress only making him more tense. Clara appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at the situation and took command. "Sit him down," she said to Elsie, her tone calm and authoritative. "And boil water. Bring the whiskey from the sideboard and my sewing basket." Elsie, grateful for the direction, hurried to obey. Clara, with a practiced hand, slit the fabric of Luke's trousers to expose a deep, ragged gash. She worked without hesitation, cleaning the wound with whiskey-soaked rags, her touch gentle but firm. Luke hissed in pain but sat perfectly still, his trust in her absolute. As she stitched the wound closed with a clean needle and thread, her head bent in concentration. Elsie watched from the doorway. She saw the quiet intimacy of it, the way Luke's body was relaxed under Clara's care, the unspoken communication that flowed between them. It wasn't the intimacy of a husband and wife, but something older, deeper. It was the bond of two people who understood each other's pain without the need for words. A painful knot of understanding tightened in Elsie's chest. Luke felt as though he were being torn in two. He would lie in bed at night, Elsie's soft, warm body beside him, and his mind would drift to the small, quiet room at the back of the house. Elsie was his wife. He had made a vow to her. She was young and full of a hope he felt he was slowly killing with his silence. He owed her his loyalty, his protection, a chance at happiness. He tried to give it to her, speaking to her of the ranch, of the seasons, trying to draw her into his world, but his heart felt like a locked room, and he couldn't find the key. His thoughts were haunted by Clara. He saw her in the rhythm of the household, in the clean-smelling sheets on his bed, in the comforting taste of the coffee she made just the way he liked it. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, yet her quiet, resilient presence had become the anchor of his life. He felt a fierce, protective urge toward her, a deep and troubling tenderness that felt like a betrayal of the woman sleeping beside him. He was a man with 2 women under his roof, and he was failing them both. The silence in his house was of his own making, a product of a heart divided against itself. The breaking point came on a trip to town. While Luke was negotiating with the freight agent, Elsie went into the general store for thread. 2 local women, wives of neighboring ranchers, were talking by the pickle barrel. They lowered their voices when she entered, but not enough. "The new one looks soft," one of them murmured. "Soft won't last out here," the other replied, her voice sharp. "Still, can't blame her for trying. It's a strange household. McCready keeps the other one on. You know, the dark-haired widow lives right there with them. 2 women for 1 man. It ain't decent." The word struck Elsie like a physical slap. The blood drained from her face, then rushed back in a hot, shameful tide. So this is what they thought of her. Not as a respectable wife, but as part of some sordid, shameful arrangement. Her dreams of a new life, a respected place in a community, crumbled into dust. She was a laughingstock. She fled the store, her purchase forgotten. The ride home was a torment of silent fury. As soon as they reached the ranch, she turned on Luke, her voice shaking with a pain that was deeper than anger. "They're talking about us, about me. They think she is they think you have 2 wives." She choked on the word. "How could you do this to me? How could you shame me like this?" Luke had no answer. The accusation struck too close to the guilty truth in his own heart. He could only stand there, his face a grim mask. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, angry gray. The wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the house, a perfect match for the tempest in Elsie's soul. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear his silence, the shame, the thought of Clara in the next room, hearing every word. With a sob of pure anguish, she turned and ran from the house, out into the teeth of the coming storm. Luke started after her, but Clara was already at the door, pulling on Luke's heavy oilskin coat. "Let me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "She's not angry at you, not really. She won't want you to be the one to find her." He stopped, recognizing the stark truth in her words. He watched as Clara disappeared into the gathering dusk, her small, determined figure leaning into the gale. The storm broke with a vengeance. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry ground to slick, treacherous mud. Thunder cracked overhead, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Clara pressed on, her face shielded by the wide brim of Luke's hat, calling Elsie's name into the roaring darkness. She knew where the girl would have gone, away from the ranch, toward the only landmark for miles, the cottonwood-lined creek. She found her there, at the edge of the water. The creek, normally a placid stream, was now a churning, muddy torrent, swollen with runoff. Elsie had slipped on the greasy bank and was clinging desperately to an exposed tree root, the rising water swirling hungrily around her ankles. She was crying, her face streaked with rain and tears, her terror a palpable thing even in the storm. Clara didn't hesitate. She slid down the bank, the mud sucking at her boots, until she was on a ledge just above the girl. "Elsie, give me your hand!" she shouted over the roar of the water. Elsie looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't. I'll pull you in." "You will not. I'm stronger than I look. Now, give me your hand." Clara's voice was a command, a lifeline of pure certainty in the chaos. Elsie reached up a trembling, muddy hand, and Clara's fingers closed around her wrist like a vice, with a strength born of desperation and sheer will. Clara heaved. For a moment, it was a stalemate, a battle against the slick mud and the pull of the water. Then, with a final, guttural cry, Clara hauled Elsie up onto the relative safety of the bank. They lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the cold rain plastering their hair to their faces. They couldn't return to the ranch. Crossing the open prairie in this deluge was impossible. But Clara knew of a place, an old, abandoned line shack, not a half-mile away, nestled in a small ravine. Taking Elsie's hand, she pulled her to her feet and led her through the storm. The shack was little more than 4 crude walls and a leaky roof, but it was shelter. Shivering violently, they stumbled inside, out of the wind, in the darkness. Clara fumbled through her sodden pockets and produced a small, waterproof tin containing a few matches and a piece of flint, with numb fingers. She managed to coax a tiny, sputtering flame from a pile of dry tinder she found in a corner. The fire slowly grew, pushing back the darkness and the chill. In its flickering, uncertain light, the 2 women looked at each other. They were stripped of their roles, their defenses washed away by the storm. They were just 2 human beings, soaked, shivering, and utterly alone. A great shuddering sob broke from Elsie. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of hope finally giving way to despair. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't belong here. I can't do this." Clara moved closer, the firelight casting long shadows on her weary face. She looked at the weeping girl, and for the first time, she felt no jealousy, no resentment, only a profound and weary empathy. "No one belongs here at first," Clara said softly, her voice raspy. "The land doesn't want you. You have to make it want you, or you learn to endure." The simple, unvarnished truth of her words cut through Elsie's self-pity. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw the deep, settled sorrow in her eyes, the resilience carved into the lines of her face. She saw another woman who was just as lost as she was. Hesitantly, Clara reached out and put an arm around Elsie's trembling shoulders. The touch was awkward at first, then firm. Elsie leaned into it, her sobs quieting, and rested her head on Clara's shoulder. They huddled together, 2 solitary souls finding a fragile, unexpected warmth in the heart of the storm. The wind howled outside the little shack, but inside, by the light of a tiny fire, a quiet, momentous shift had occurred. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was acceptance, and in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of their lives, it was a start. They returned from the line shack the next morning as the storm broke, 2 weary figures walking in the clean-washed air. The world smelled of wet earth and sage. Luke was waiting on the porch, his face etched with a night of worry, when he saw them emerge from the ravine together, not as mistress and servant, but as 2 women who had weathered the same gale. The tension in his shoulders eased. He said nothing, but the relief in his gray eyes was a confession in itself. The storm had broken more than just the weather. The icy wall between Clara and Elsie had cracked and thawed into a fragile, uncertain truce. The silence in the house changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of animosity, but a lighter, more awkward quiet of discovery. Words, once hoarded like precious coins, were spent on small necessities. "The stove needs wood. Elsie. Clara, do you need help with the churn?" They began to learn the rhythms of each other's presence. Elsie discovered that Clara hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when she needed bread. Clara learned that Elsie had a small, secret smile that appeared only when she saw the first star in the evening sky. They were 2 planets that had been forced into the same orbit, and they were learning how to move without colliding. But their son was Luke. His presence was a constant, gravitational pull that complicated every interaction. When he was in the room, they were both acutely aware of him, and of their own confusing roles. An unspoken question hung in the air. What were they now? The tension was no longer one of conflict, but of a strange, simmering curiosity. There was an awareness between them, a recognition of womanhood, of shared space around a man who belonged legally to one, and emotionally, in some indefinable way, to the other. This fragile new world was shattered by the shriek of tearing wood and a cry of raw agony from the yard. Luke had been reinforcing the holding pen, setting new, heavy cedar posts. One of the old crossbeams, rotten from years of weather, had given way as he hoisted a post into place. The full weight of the cedar had slammed him against the fence, the sound a sickening crunch that sent a flock of crows scattering into the sky. Elsie and Clara ran from the house together. They found him slumped on the ground, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his left arm held at a grotesque angle. His breathing was shallow, each gasp a fresh wave of pain. "My shoulder," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Ribs, I think." Panic seized Elsie. Her mind went blank with terror, but Clara was already in motion. "Help me get him inside," she commanded, her voice a sharp, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "Elsie, take his good side. I'll take the other. Easy, now." Getting him into the house was a nightmare of shared, agonizing effort. He was a heavy man, and nearly dead weight. They had to coordinate their movements, their bodies pressing close, their breath mingling. Clara's strength was a surprise, a wiry, unyielding force that supported Luke's broken body. They half dragged, half carried him to his and Elsie's bed, lowering him gently onto the mattress. He groaned, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. The room became a blur of focused activity, a small, lamp-lit world against the encroaching dusk. "We need to get this shirt off him," Clara said, her voice low, and set the shoulder. "I've seen it done. Elsie, I need hot water, clean rags, and the laudanum from the medicine box, and the whiskey." As Elsie hurried to obey, Clara took a deep breath and began to work on the buttons of Luke's heavy flannel shirt. Her fingers were deft and impersonal, but she was intensely aware of the heat of his skin beneath the fabric, the hard muscle of his chest, the vulnerable pulse beating in his throat. When Elsie returned, the room was already thick with the scent of pain and fear. Together, they eased the shirt off his injured side, revealing the damage. His shoulder was clearly dislocated, a pale, unnatural lump beneath the skin. A dark, ugly bruise was already spreading across his ribs. The sight was intimate and brutal. This strong, self-reliant man was broken, helpless, delivered into their hands. A new, powerful current began to arc between the three of them, a raw and unsettling energy. "Hold him steady," Clara instructed, her voice tight with concentration. "This will hurt." Elsie knelt on the other side of the bed, her hands, small and trembling, pressing down on Luke's good shoulder. Clara positioned herself, took hold of his injured arm, and with a grunt of exertion, pulled and twisted. There was a sickening wet pop as the joint slid back into place. Luke roared, a deep, guttural sound of pure agony that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. And then he slumped back, his body going limp, his breathing ragged but easier. For a long moment, the only sound was their collective, ragged breathing. The air was heavy, charged with the aftermath of violence and the intimacy of shared trauma. Lamplight cast flickering shadows, making the small room feel like a confessional. Their hands were still on him, Clara's on his now mended shoulder, Elsie's on his chest. Their eyes met over his still form. In that shared gaze, they were not wife and housekeeper. They were partners in a desperate act of healing, their hands linked by the body of the man between them. They worked together through the evening, cleaning his cuts, wrapping his ribs tightly with strips of clean linen. Their movements became a silent, intuitive dance. Their fingers brushed as they applied a soothing salve to his bruised skin. They felt the heat of his fever, the shudder that ran through him. They were bound together by a shared purpose, a shared touch. For Elsie, it was the first time she had tended to her husband with such purpose, her touch not one of a wife's duty in the dark, but of a healer's care in the stark lamplight. For Clara, every touch was a torment, a confirmation of a love she had to keep buried, now brought into the raw, open air. The room was no longer just a bedroom. It was a crucible, and the heat of it was forging something new and dangerous between them. In the days that followed, as Luke lay feverish and in pain, the two women became his constant caretakers. The last of the barriers between them dissolved in the shared, weary work of changing bandages, spooning broth into his mouth, and keeping vigil through long, quiet nights. But for Clara, this new intimacy was a special kind of hell. As Luke began to heal, he would wake for longer periods. His eyes would follow her around the room, a silent, weighty gratitude in their depths. She would see Elsie read to him from the Bible, her voice a soft, soothing murmur. She watched a wife caring for her husband, and she knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in her gut, that she was the ghost at this feast. Her presence, once a comfort, was now a complication. The truth she had found with Elsie only made it more painful. She was no longer a rival. She was simply superfluous, an extra gear in a machine built for two. The decision came to her in the deep quiet of the third night, as she watched Elsie sleep in a chair by the bed, her head fallen to one side. The kindest thing, the only decent thing, was to remove herself from the equation. For Elsie's sake, for Luke's, she would go before dawn, leaving them to build the life they were meant to have, unburdened by her shadow. She packed her small bundle, the same one she had arrived with, its contents unchanged. She moved with the silence she had perfected, a ghost preparing for her own exorcism. She wrote a short, simple note. "Thank you for your kindness. I wish you both peace," and left it on the kitchen table. The back door creaked, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the still house. "Clara," Luke's voice. It was weak, but it cut through the darkness and stopped her cold. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, leaning heavily against the frame, his face pale in the moonlight. He had pulled on his trousers, his chest and shoulders still tightly bound. "Don't," he said, the single word filled with a desperate plea. "I have to," she whispered, her voice thick. "She is your wife. Luke, this is her home now. There's no place for me here." "You're wrong." He took a painful, shuffling step toward her. "You are the reason this is a home at all." "That was the arrangement," she said, forcing the words out. "The arrangement is over." "To hell with the arrangement," he rasped, a sudden fire in his voice. He winced, clutching his bandaged ribs. "Clara, listen to me. I sent for Elsie because I was a coward. I was lonely, and it was a practical solution. I told myself I'd do my duty, that my heart would follow. I intended to ask you to leave when she arrived." The confession, though she had suspected it, was a fresh wound. She flinched as if struck. He saw it and pushed on, his voice dropping, raw with an honesty born of pain and the fear of losing her. "But I couldn't, and I can't now. I lie in that bed, and I see her, and I feel a tenderness, a duty, a hope for a future. She is good and kind, and I want to be the husband she deserves. But then I see you, Clara, and I feel grounded. I feel a quietness in my soul that I haven't felt since before the fever took Mary. It's not the same. What I feel for the two of you, it's not the same, but it's both real. And God help me, I don't know how to live without either." His words, a confession of a divided heart, left her stunned and speechless. She could only stare at him, her escape forgotten. The world tilted on its axis. A few nights later, an uneasy peace had settled. Luke was recovering, able to sit in a chair by the hearth, though still weak. The conversation, his impossible confession, lay unspoken between the three of them. One night, Elsie couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, her mind too loud. She slipped out of bed and walked into the main room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and a single lamp cast a soft, golden pool of light. Clara was there, sitting on a low stool, her head bent, mending one of Luke's shirts by the lamplight. Luke was awake in his armchair nearby, watching her, as Elsie watched from the shadows of the hallway. Luke reached out with his good hand. He didn't speak. He simply laid his hand over Clara's, stilling the needle. Her fingers stopped their work, but they didn't pull away. They rested together under his, a moment of profound, silent communion. It was a gesture of such deep, weary, and tender affection that it transcended passion. It was two solitudes, touching. Elsie's breath caught in her throat. She waited for the familiar, hot sting of jealousy, the bitter anger, but it didn't come. Instead, a strange, aching tremor went through her. She wasn't watching a betrayal. She was watching a truth as solid and real as the stone of the hearth. And what frightened her, what made her tremble, was the dawning realization that she didn't want to destroy it. A part of her, a part she didn't understand, was drawn to it, to its quiet, powerful gravity. She felt a pull not of exclusion but of a strange, inexplicable longing to be a part of that silent, shared light. The next day, the dam of silence finally broke. Clara, unable to bear the weight of Luke's confession any longer, confronted him while Elsie was outside. "What you said the other night, what do you expect? What do you want from us?" He looked at her, his face haggard. "I want for us to find a way, for us to stay." It was the final confirmation. It was not a choice between them, but a desire for both. All the pain, the humiliation, the silent suffering of the past months coalesced into a single, sharp point of fury inside Clara. "Away?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "You want your wife to warm your bed and your housekeeper to warm your hearth? You want us to share you like a loaf of bread? You are a selfish, cruel man. Luke Macready." Her hand flew up, and the sharp crack of her palm against his cheek echoed in the quiet house. He didn't flinch, only looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. The anger gave her strength. She stood tall, her eyes blazing. "You think because this world has broken me that I will settle for scraps? That I will live in shame as the other woman in your house?" She turned on her heel to leave, to finally walk away and never look back. But as she turned, her proud, furious mask crumbled. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her face. She wasn't just angry at him for wanting the impossible. She was heartbroken, because a terrified, secret part of her soul wanted it too. The slap echoed in the quiet house for days. It was a sound that had broken the tension and, in its place, left a brittle, fragile stillness. Clara's anger had spent itself, leaving behind the bitter ash of shame and a deep, aching sorrow. They moved around each other with a renewed, painful carefulness, the air thick with the impossible thing Luke had asked for and the violent, honest way she had refused it. But the world outside their troubled sanctuary did not wait. The whispers that had started in the general store had grown into a low, steady murmur that followed them whenever they went to town. It was no longer just gossip. It was a judgment. Women who had once nodded a polite greeting now turned their heads, pulling their children closer as if proximity to the Macready household was a contagion. Men in front of the saloon would stop their conversations, their eyes following Luke with a mixture of leering curiosity and open contempt. The ranch became a lonely island in a sea of disapproval. The unspoken arrangement within its walls, so fraught with private turmoil, was now a public spectacle, twisted by ignorance and suspicion into something ugly and indecent. The town's judgment soon found its voice in the form of Sheriff Brody. He was a thick-set man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. He had made his unwelcome interest in Clara known not long after she'd first arrived. His offers of protection, for a woman alone carrying a heavy, greasy implication. Her polite but firm refusal had pricked his pride. And now he had his excuse for retribution. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his silver star glinting in the harsh sunlight, a symbol of a law that served the prejudices of the majority. He found Luke reinforcing the corral fence, his shoulder and ribs still wrapped. "McCready," Brody said, not dismounting, forcing Luke to look up at him. "Been hearing some talk in town, unsettling talk." Luke drove a nail into the post with a steady hand before turning. "Talk is cheap, Brody." "Not this kind," the sheriff said, his eyes flicking toward the house, where he knew the women were. "Folks are saying it ain't a decent home you're keeping. A man with a new wife, still keeping another woman under his roof. A woman of questionable history." His gaze was pointed. He was talking about Clara. "It's a moral blight on the community. There are laws, laws against vagrancy, lewd conduct. It'd be a shame if I had to enforce them on that poor, unfortunate widow you're harboring." The threat was clear. Wrapped in the sanctimonious cloth of public duty, he was using Clara's vulnerability as a weapon against them all. "Clara is my housekeeper," Luke said, his voice dangerously low. "My wife Elsie knows it. It is my business, on my land." "It becomes my business when it offends public decency," Brody countered, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You'd be wise to fix this situation. A man can only have one woman in his house that he calls by his name. Send the other one packing. It's for the best." He tipped his hat with false politeness and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his malice in the air. The sheriff's visit was a declaration of war. The pressure was no longer a matter of averted gazes and whispers. It was a direct threat to their fragile existence. A few nights later, Luke rode into town for salt and grain, a necessary trip he had put off for too long. He knew it was a risk, but their supplies were low. He didn't return by nightfall. As the moon rose, a knot of anxiety tightened in Elsie's chest. Clara, seeing her unease, put down her mending. "We'll go find him," she said, her voice calm and resolute. It wasn't a question. They saddled 2 horses and rode toward the faint lights of town, a silent, unified force. They found him in the alley behind the saloon. He was being pushed out the back door by the burly saloon keeper, his face a mess of fresh bruises, his lips split and bleeding. 2 other men, local ranchers with more piety than sense, stood by, dusting off their knuckles. "And stay out, McCready!" one of them slurred. "We don't want your kind in here, defiling our town with your filthy habits." Luke stumbled but caught himself against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was outnumbered, and his still-healing ribs put him at a disadvantage. He looked up, and his eyes met Clara's and Elsie's as they reined in their horses at the mouth of the alley. The sight of them, sitting tall in their saddles, their faces pale with fury in the moonlight, seemed to momentarily stun the other men into silence. Without a word, Clara dismounted. Elsie was right behind her. They went to Luke, one on each side, and slipped their arms through his, supporting his weight. Clara turned a look of such cold, quiet contempt on the men that they shuffled their feet and looked away. Elsie, who had once been terrified of these people's opinions, now met their gazes with a fiery defiance she didn't know she possessed. Together, the 3 of them walked away from the saloon, a silent, broken but unbreakable trinity, leaving their accusers to the shadows of the alley. The ride home was wordless. Back in the lamplit quiet of the kitchen, they tended to his new wounds. Elsie gently washed the blood from his face with a soft cloth while Clara fetched a salve for the cuts. The anger from Clara's slap a week ago felt like a lifetime away. It had been a personal anger, born of her own hurt. This was different. This was a shared wound, inflicted by a hostile world. Luke sat slumped in a chair, exhausted and in pain. He looked at Clara, then at Elsie. He reached out his hands, palms up, on the table between them. After a moment's hesitation, Clara placed her hand in his. Then, Elsie laid her hand over both of theirs. The three hands, one calloused and bruised, two softer but no less strong, clasped together. It was a silent pact. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Later that night, after Luke had fallen into an exhausted sleep, the two women sat by the dying fire. The shared danger had stripped away the last of their reservations.
"They hate us,"
Elsie said, her voice a whisper.
"I never knew people could be so full of hate."
Clara stared into the glowing embers, a landscape of memory and pain in her eyes. "They don't hate you, Elsie. They fear what they don't understand, and they punish what they fear." She took a slow, deep breath and began to speak of things she had never told another living soul. "The man I was married to before, he was a good man in the eyes of the world," she began, her voice low and even, as if reciting a history that belonged to someone else. "He didn't drink to excess, and he provided for our home, but the doors of a house hide many truths. His hands were heavy. He believed a wife was a property, to be corrected when she was disobedient or disappointing." Elsie listened, her heart aching, not daring to interrupt. "We wanted children," Clara continued, her voice growing thick. "It was all I ever wanted, to have a child to hold, but the years passed, and my belly remained empty. Each month was a fresh failure, a fresh reason for his disappointment to turn to rage." She looked down at her own hands, as if seeing the ghosts of old bruises. "Finally, he took me to a doctor in a big city. The doctor examined me, poked and prodded like I was livestock, and then he declared me barren, a sealed vessel, useless." The clinical cruelty of the word hung in the air. "My husband didn't strike me after that. He simply stopped seeing me. I was a broken piece of farm equipment. He brought me back to our town, told the elders I was unable to fulfill my duties as a wife, and the church granted him a release from our marriage. I was cast out. The women whispered that a barren womb was a sign of God's displeasure. The men looked at me either with pity or with the same hunger Sheriff Brody has. I had no family to take me in. I had failed at the only thing a woman is supposed to be good for. That is why I was walking when Luke found me. I was walking away from a life where I no longer had a name or a place." When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Clara had not cried. She had offered her story as a stark, unadorned testimony. Elsie's eyes, however, were filled with tears. She looked at this strong, quiet woman and saw not a rival, but a survivor of a different kind of wilderness. Then, Elsie found her own voice. "They think I'm better than you," she whispered, a bitter irony in her tone. "They see my wedding ring. They think I am the proper wife, but they don't know the truth about me either." She looked at Clara, her gaze direct and filled with a pain of her own. "My father was a merchant in Ohio. He had a fine house and a good name, but he had a weakness for card games. He fell into debt with a powerful man, a man who had a son he wanted to see established, but no dowry to offer. So they made a trade." Elsie's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "My father's debts were forgiven. In exchange, I was to be sent west, to a man who needed a wife and was willing to pay the cost of my travel. I was not a daughter being sent to a new life. Clara, I was a debt, being paid, a piece of cargo. My parents smiled and told me it was a grand adventure, a chance to be a pioneer wife, but I knew. I saw the relief in their eyes, the relief of being unburdened. For the first time, the two women truly saw each other. All the layers of wife, housekeeper, rival, and stranger were stripped away. They saw two different versions of the same story. Women treated as property, their worth determined by their wombs or their value in a transaction. They were not defined by their relationship to Luke, but by their shared experience of being broken and discarded by the world. They were survivors. Elsie reached across the space between them and took Clara's hand. This time, it was just the two of them. Their grip was a testament to a bond forged in the fire of confession. stronger than any marriage vow. A few nights later, the physical wounds had begun to heal, and the emotional ones, though raw, were no longer hidden. The three of them sat before the hearth, the fire casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. A new kind of quiet had settled in the house, a quiet not of tension or avoidance, but of deep, shared understanding. Luke had been watching the two women. He saw the way Elsie now deferred to Clara's knowledge of the house, not with resentment, but with respect. He saw the way Clara would pour Elsie a cup of tea without being asked. They were no longer two separate entities orbiting him. They had become a system of their own. He looked from Clara's resilient, sorrowful face to Elsie's youthful face, now etched with a new, hard-won wisdom. A question had been forming in his mind, a question born of humility and a dawning awe at what was growing between them. He cleared his throat, and they both looked at him. His voice was low, heavy with the weight of his words. "The world has decided there's no place for us like this," he said simply. "Brody and the others, they want me to choose, to send one of you away and make this house a decent again." He paused, his gray eyes moving between them, holding them both in his gaze. "But what if I don't? What if I can't?" He leaned forward, the firelight catching the earnest, desperate pain in his face. "If I don't choose, can you choose each other?" The question was revolutionary, terrifying. He wasn't asking them to share him. He was asking if the bond they had forged, the one born in a storm and sealed with scars, was strong enough to be its own foundation. He was asking if they could become a we that the world had no name for. A vast, ringing silence descended on the room. Clara froze, her mind unable to grasp the shape of what he was offering. It was a world beyond her imagination, a world without the cruel arithmetic of one man, one wife. But Elsie, who had come to this place with the simplest and most conventional of dreams, had seen those dreams burn to ash and had found something stronger in their place. She looked at Clara's face, saw the fear and the flicker of a desperate, terrified hope. She looked at Luke, saw his surrender, his plea. She understood. He was not a king on a throne, demanding tribute. He was a man in the middle of a bridge he had built, asking if they would dare to cross it with him. Slowly, deliberately. Elsie stood up. She walked over to Clara, who remained seated, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. Elsie knelt before her and took her hand. It was cold and trembling. She held it for a moment, her grip firm and warm. Then, without a word, she rose and gently pulled Clara to her feet, still holding her hand. She led her across the small space of the hearth rug, to where Luke sat waiting. She did not release Clara's hand. Instead, she reached out her other hand and placed it in Luke's, and so they stood, a chain of three, bound together in the flickering firelight, a silent, radical answer in a world that had no words for what they were becoming. Life in the Macready house rearranged itself, settling into a new and nameless shape. They did not speak of what they were, for there were no words for it in any language they knew. Instead, they lived it. They built their new world in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the shared language of gestures and glances. It was a secret world, protected by the very isolation that had once been a source of pain. The ranch became their fortress, and within its walls, they were simply a family. The days found a gentle, flowing rhythm. Mornings were no longer a tense negotiation of space. They would move through the kitchen together, a dance of quiet collaboration. Elsie, her hands now more confident, would grind the coffee beans while Clara kneaded the biscuit dough, their movements easy and synchronized. Luke would come in from the barn, and the sight of them working together in the warm, yeasty air would bring a look of profound, weary peace to his face. He would pour 3 cups of coffee, not 2, and they would sit at the table, the morning light slanting across the floor, and plan the day's labor. They worked to mend more than just their hearts. They mended the ranch, The storm-damaged corral became their first joint project. It was hard, physical work under the relentless sun. Luke, his strength returned, would set the heavy posts, his muscles straining. Elsie, surprisingly nimble, would fetch and carry, handing him tools, her presence a bright spot of energy. Clara, her competence a quiet force, would measure the crossbeams, ensuring everything was square and true. There was an easy camaraderie in their shared sweat and effort. Laughter, a sound that had long been a stranger in that house, began to make a tentative return, sparked by a dropped hammer or a shared, exasperated sigh at a stubborn post. In these moments, they were not a man and two women. They were builders, partners in the act of creating something strong and lasting. The evenings were soft and quiet. They would sit on the porch and watch the sky bleed from orange to purple, the vast silence of the prairie no longer a threat, but a comforting blanket. Sometimes Elsie would read aloud from a worn book of poems, her voice a soft melody against the chirping of the crickets. Other times, no words were needed. Luke might whittle a piece of wood, the shavings falling at his feet, while Clara darned a sock and Elsie stared up at the emerging stars, her head resting near Clara's shoulder. An unspoken tenderness flowed between them, as real and potent as the cool night air. It was in the way Luke would rise and gently place a shawl over both their shoulders, a single gesture that encompassed them both. It was in the way Clara would instinctively reach out to steady Elsie's rocking chair when it tipped too far. They were learning to care for one another in 1,000 small, unspoken ways, weaving the fabric of their new reality, thread by loving thread. But beneath the gentle surface of their days, a deeper current was pulling them, a current of unspoken longing that grew stronger with each shared look, each accidental brush of hands. Their separate rooms at night became a fiction, a concession to a world that no longer had any claim on them. The love between them was a three-pointed star, and they could feel its inexorable gravity drawing them toward a single, shared center. It happened on a night when the moon was a sliver of silver and the stars were so bright and close they seemed to be singing. The day had been long, the work hard, and a bone-deep weariness had settled over them. But it was a good weariness, the kind that comes from a day well spent. The fire had burned down to a bed of pulsing embers, casting a soft, red glow on their faces. They were not speaking, but the silence was alive, humming with everything they had become. Luke sat in his armchair, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the fire. He was their center, their anchor, but he was waiting. He had asked his question, "Can you choose each other?" And he had left the answer to them. Clara sat on her low stool, a mending basket forgotten in her lap. Elsie was on a rug at her feet, leaning against Clara's knees, slowly, as if in a dream. Elsie turned. She looked up at Clara, her eyes dark pools in the firelight, reflecting a question that was both fearful and brave. Clara looked down at her, and in that gaze, the last wall crumbled. There was no fear left, only a deep, resounding truth. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an assent, a surrender, a beginning. Elsie took Clara's hand, her fingers lacing through Clara's own. It was the same gesture she had made before, but this time it was not a question. It was a statement. Together, they rose as one. The movement was fluid, unhesitating. They turned to face Luke. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. He saw not two separate women, but a single, unified whole. Their hands clasped between them, their faces illuminated by a shared, resolute purpose. They walked the few steps to his chair and knelt before him. There was no jealousy in the air, no sense of victory or defeat. There was only a profound and overwhelming sense of rightness, of a fractured thing finally being made whole. Clara reached out her free hand and touched his face, her thumb gently tracing the line of his jaw. Elsie leaned forward and rested her head against his knee. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. Then he opened them and drew them both into his arms, pulling them into the circle of firelight, into the circle of his heart, into the quiet, starlit center of their new world. It was a union not of flesh alone, but of three scarred and weary souls finding their final, true home in one another. The world, however, does not long tolerate secrets. A lone rider, a trapper on his way back to town, had cut across McCready Land at dawn the next morning, seeking a shortcut. He had seen a light in the upstairs window, the window of Luke and Elsie's room, and had seen three silhouettes move as one against the curtain. It was a fleeting, indistinct image, but in the fertile ground of the town's suspicion, it was all the seed that was needed. By noon, the trapper's story, embellished and twisted with each telling, had become a sordid certainty. Sheriff Brody had his proof. He didn't ride out alone this time. He came with 2 deputies and one of the town's founding elders, a man whose face was a permanent mask of grim piety. They did not come with a warrant. They came with the unshakable authority of righteous indignation. They found the 3 of them in the corral, working to replace a broken gate. The sight of them working together, their movements so easy and familiar, only confirmed the town's worst fears. "Clara Monroe," Brody said, his voice ringing with false authority. The use of her former husband's name was a deliberate cruelty. "You are summoned to the town hall. There are charges to be answered." "Charges of what?" Luke demanded, stepping in front of her. "Vagrancy, lewdness, moral indecency," the elder supplied, his voice dripping with distaste. He looked at Luke. "This town has laws. McCready, both God's and man's. You have brought a sickness into our community. You will come to the hall and you will end it. You will choose your wife, and you will cast this other woman out. If you do not, she will be sent to the county workhouse." The threat was absolute. They had cornered them, using Clara as their pawn, knowing she had no legal protection. For a moment, a terrible silence fell. They were trapped. To fight was to lose Clara. To submit was to shatter the world they had just built. Luke looked at Elsie's pale, determined face. He looked at Clara's, her expression a mixture of terror and resignation. She had been cast out before and was preparing herself for it again. He looked at the smug, triumphant faces of the men before him, and in that moment, he made his choice. It was not the choice they were offering. "We'll be at the town hall," he said, his voice flat and cold. He turned his back on them and led Elsie and Clara toward the house. He didn't go to the town hall to argue or plead. He went to pack. When the sheriff and his posse arrived an hour later, expecting a confrontation, they found the ranch house nearly empty. The wagon was loaded with their few essential belongings: tools, bedding, sacks of flour and beans, 2 rifles, and a small wooden box containing the remnants of 2 past lives and the seeds of a new one. "What is this?" Brody demanded, his face purpling with rage. "We're leaving," Luke said simply. He helped Elsie onto the wagon seat, then turned and offered his hand to Clara. "This land, this town, you can have it. We don't want it anymore." He climbed up beside them, took the reins, and with a sharp click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. He didn't look back. They rode out of the yard and onto the open prairie, leaving behind the only home they had known, turning their faces toward the vast, unknown promise of the West. Their war with the town was over. Their war for survival had just begun. The journey was a crucible. The prairie was a vast, unforgiving ocean of grass under a brassy sky. Days were a monotonous cycle of heat, dust, and the creak of the wagon wheels. Nights were a small circle of firelight in an immense, breathing darkness. They were utterly alone, their lives reduced to the elemental tasks of finding water, hunting for game, and staying alive. The hardship, instead of breaking them, forged them into something harder, stronger. They became a single entity with 3 sets of eyes, 3 minds, and 6 hands. Luke was the navigator and the hunter, his knowledge of the land their compass, Elsie, shedding the last of her eastern softness, became the forager, her sharp eyes spotting wild onions and berries that Clara would cook into their meager meals. Clara was the heart of their camp, the healer, the one who conserved their resources with a fierce, practiced economy. Their old roles were gone, replaced by new ones defined by pure necessity. They were a perfectly balanced unit, each part essential to the whole. About 3 weeks into their journey, in the broken hilly country that marked the edge of the plains, their new life was put to its ultimate test. They had made camp in a small, defensible hollow when 4 riders appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the setting sun. They were not settlers or trappers. Their hard, feral look marked them as men who lived by taking, not by making. "Stay in the wagon," Luke ordered in a low voice, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay down." The men rode down into the hollow, their approach casual, predatory. "That's a fine team of horses you got there." "Friend," their leader said, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes. "And a well-stocked wagon. We'd be willing to take them off your hands." "You'd be willing to try," Luke said, his rifle held steady. The world exploded in a chaos of smoke and noise. The bandits charged, firing wildly. Luke dropped to one knee behind the wagon wheel, returning fire with a calm, deadly precision. A horse screamed and went down, but there were too many. One of them was circling around, trying to get a clear shot at Luke from the side. Inside the wagon, Elsie and Clara were huddled together, the sounds of the gunfight a deafening roar. Elsie saw the man circling. She saw him raise his pistol. There was no time to think. She grabbed the second rifle, the one they kept loaded for emergencies. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was ice cold. She pushed the barrel through a gap in the canvas cover, took a breath as she had seen Luke do, and fired. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder. A brutal, shocking pain. She hadn't aimed so much as pointed, but the shot went true. The rider cried out, clutching his side, and tumbled from his horse. The sight of their man going down, shot by an unseen defender, broke the attacker's nerve. The remaining 2 grabbed their wounded companion, threw him over his saddle, and fled back into the hills. The silence that descended was more shocking than the noise. Smoke hung in the still air, acrid and sharp. Luke was leaning against the wagon, his face pale, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. "Luke!" Clara was out of the wagon in an instant, her medical supplies already in her hands. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm. It was a clean wound, but bleeding heavily. As Clara worked with a desperate, focused calm, staunching the blood and bandaging the wound, Elsie stumbled out of the wagon, the heavy rifle still in her hands, her face white with shock. She looked at the dark patch of blood on the ground where the bandit had fallen. She looked at Luke, leaning on Clara, his life saved by her hand. He met her gaze, and in his eyes was a look of such profound, astonished pride and gratitude that it stole her breath. In that moment of blood and smoke, they were fully born. Clara, the healer, had saved his body. Elsie, the unexpected warrior, had saved his life. And Luke, their protector, had given them a reason to be strong. They were no longer running from a world that had rejected them. They were fighting for a world they were building, a world that belonged only to the 3 of them. They stood together in the fading light, wounded but victorious, their bond no longer a matter of the heart, but a covenant sealed in gunpowder and blood. They traveled west for 2 more months, leaving the flat, unforgiving plains behind them. The land began to rise, to fold and buckle into foothills covered in pine and aspen. They followed the curve of a rushing river until it led them into a high mountain valley, a place of such breathtaking, secluded beauty. It felt like the world's first morning. A meadow of green grass, thick with wildflowers, was sheltered by a towering granite ridge to the north that blocked the worst of the winter winds. A clear, cold creek cut through the meadow, and a stand of tall timber offered all the building material they would ever need. They stopped the wagon at the edge of the trees, and for a long time, no one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the rush of the creek, the whisper of wind in the pines, and the distant call of an eagle. This was it. This was the place where their journey ended and their life began. Building the cabin was an act of love. It was slow, back-breaking work, but they moved as a single, determined unit. Luke, with his skill and strength, felled the trees and notched the logs. Clara, with her methodical mind, chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and moss, ensuring their home would be warm and tight against the coming snows. Elsie, tireless and quick, gathered stones for the hearth and fireplace, her laughter echoing in the clear mountain air as she and Luke struggled to lift the heavy lintel stone into place. They were not just building a shelter. They were building a home from the memory of what a home should be. It was small, just one large room with a sleeping loft above, but it was theirs. Every log was a testament to their shared effort. Every stone in the hearth a symbol of the warmth they had found in one another. As the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, they moved in, their small sanctuary complete, a bastion of their own making against a world they had left behind. Their new life was pared down to its essentials, and in that simplicity, they found a profound peace. Luke hunted in the high country, bringing back venison and elk. The two women worked together, smoking the meat, tending a small winter garden of hardy greens that Clara had nurtured from seeds, and sewing new clothes from bolts of wool and flannel traded from a traveling peddler. There was a rhythm to their days, a quiet harmony that was more intimate than any spoken words of love. It was in the way Elsie would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for Luke when he came in from the cold, and the way Clara would have a salve ready for his chapped hands. It was in the way Luke would leave a bucket of fresh, clear water on the porch for them each morning, and the way Elsie would brush the tangles from Clara's long, dark hair by the fire at night. They were a family, not by law or convention, but by the deeper, truer law of shared survival and mutual care. One day in late spring, as the last of the snow was melting from the meadow, a stranger rode into their valley. He was a trapper, lean and weathered, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a man who spends his life in the open. The sudden appearance of an outsider sent a jolt of old fear through them. Luke, who was splitting wood by the cabin, straightened up slowly, the axe held loose in his hand. Clara and Elsie, who had been planting seeds in their garden, stopped their work and stood together, a silent, united front. The man reined in his horse. "Afternoon," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He needed directions, asking about a pass through the mountains to the west. As he spoke, his eyes moved over the scene, the sturdy cabin, the neat garden, the two women standing so close together. His gaze was sharp, assessing, and for a heart-stopping moment, it held the same shrewd, judging quality as Sheriff Brody's. Luke saw it, and his hand tightened on the axe handle. He took a half step, placing himself more squarely between the stranger and the women. Then he reached back, not looking, and his hand found Elsie's, and Elsie's hand found Clara's. He felt their fingers lock with his, a solid, unbroken chain. The fear vanished, replaced by a calm, unshakable strength. "The pass you're looking for is 2 days north," Luke said, his voice even and steady. He gave the man clear directions. The trapper nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of surprise at the man's quiet confidence. He saw the three of them standing there, their hands linked, and whatever conclusion he drew, he kept it to himself. With a nod of thanks, he turned his horse and rode out of the valley, a fleeting shadow that soon disappeared. They stood and watched him go, their hands still clasped. The world had come to their door, and they had not flinched. They were safe. The true miracle came with the turning of the seasons. As summer warmed the high meadow, it began as a secret, a terrifying hope that Clara dared not speak aloud. She, who had been branded barren, whose body had been a source of shame and failure, felt a change within her. The familiar rhythms of her own self were altered. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of her mind, a phantom of a long-dead dream. But when the second month passed, and a morning sickness began to roil in her stomach, she could no longer deny it. She told Elsie first. They were by the creek, washing clothes, the clear water swirling around their ankles. Clara's hands stilled on the wet linen, and she looked at Elsie, her face pale, her eyes wide with a combination of terror and awe.
Elsie,
She whispered, her voice trembling.
I think I am with child.
Elsie dropped the shirt she was holding. She stared at Clara, at her friend's disbelieving face, and then down at her belly. A slow, radiant smile spread across Elsie's face, a dawn of pure, unadulterated joy. She let out a small cry that was half laugh, half sob, and threw her arms around Clara, hugging her tightly. "Clara! Oh, Clara!" They told Luke that evening. He was sitting on the porch steps, cleaning his rifle. They came and sat on either side of him. It was Clara who spoke, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, Elsie's hand covering her own.
Luke,
She said, her voice barely a whisper.
the doctor was wrong.
He stopped his work, looking from her face to their joined hands on her belly. Understanding dawned slowly, then crashed over him like a tidal wave. His tough, weathered face seemed to crumble. The rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the wooden steps. He stared at her, his mouth open, his eyes filling with tears. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it over theirs, his touch as reverent as a prayer. All three of them began to cry then, not with sorrow, but with a joy so profound and overwhelming it could only be expressed in the salt and water of tears. They were tears for the woman who thought she was broken, for the girl who thought she was merely a payment for a debt, and for the man who thought he would never know this kind of happiness again. In that small, hidden valley, the impossible had happened. Their love had borne fruit. As the months passed and Clara's belly grew round and full, a deep, settled happiness descended upon their home. One evening, they sat outside, watching the setting sun paint the granite peaks in shades of rose and gold. Clara was in a rocking chair, her hands clasped over her swelling abdomen, a look of serene wonder on her face. Elsie sat on the steps, her head resting on Luke's knee, her gaze fixed on Clara. Luke's hand rested on Elsie's shoulder, but his eyes, too, were on Clara and the new life she carried. The quiet murmur of their voices and their soft, shared laughter drifted on the cool evening air. A perfect harmony. This was the family they had made, a tapestry woven from 3 separate threads, now bound together by the promise of a 4th. One day, the traveling peddler who came through their valley twice a year brought them a letter. It was from the liveryman in their old town, a man who had shown them a small, gruff kindness. It had taken almost a year to find them. Luke opened it, and the 3 of them read it together. The letter spoke of a hard winter and a spring of biblical floods. The river that ran near their old town had broken its banks, a raging, unstoppable torrent that had swept through the valley. Much of the town had been washed away. The general store, the saloon, the small, pious church. The letter listed the names of those who had been lost. Sheriff Brody was among them. The elder who had condemned them was gone, too. They read the news in silence. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, somber sense of finality. The world that had judged and rejected them, the people who had been the architects of their pain, had been erased by the indifferent hand of nature. Their past was not just behind them. It was gone, washed clean from the face of the earth, dissolved into mud and memory. That night, the sky was a dome of infinite, glittering stars, a sight so vast and beautiful it made the heart ache. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Luke stood on the porch, looking up at the river of light that was the Milky Way. Clara came and stood beside him, her body heavy with their child. Elsie came to his other side, slipping her arm through his. He put his arms around both of them, drawing them close. His two wives, his family, the twin halves of his soul. He held them, and they leaned against him, a silent, perfect trinity under the gaze of 1,000,000 distant suns. No one spoke. No words were necessary. Their silence was a prayer, a testament, a song of love that had endured the harshest winds, a love that had walked through the fire of judgment and the wilderness of sorrow. It had overcome all tragedy, defied all prejudice, and in the deep, dark heart of the Wild West, it had found a light all its own. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And feel free to share your thoughts on Clara, Luke, and Elsie's journey.